And we're live.
Hey everybody, how are you all doing? Another week's gone by and no new video from on my end. Heretics got one coming out pretty shortly though, so
It will be done tomorrow.
all right, and I'll probably based on depending on how early in the day it's sent to me, I'll have it up either in the evening or in the afternoon the day after. But yeah, I really haven't been online since we did the stream on Friday. That had a very adventurous weekend to say the least. How have you all been?
hmm
About you,
would you?
Heretic?
I've been doing all right. It's been kind of hard getting sleep lately. Probably my fault because I've been as disciplined on the schedule as I probably should be. But yeah, would you mind telling us what happened on the weekend?
Well, for Saturday and Sunday, pretty much all day. Everybody in, I guess we'll call this the Agora house, was pretty high on on edibles, and on Monday nothing really happened, but on Tuesday we went to a Freedom Cell meetup and actually got to meet the founder of Agorist.market in person, which was pretty sweet.
Excellent. Yeah, I don't really have anything to report on my end. Everything's going steady. I've kind of divided my plans for getting out of my current situation into four phases. Phase one is already complete. Phase two is currently underway. And yeah, phase four is going to be when I am officially out of there. Or at least when phase four is done. So
Nobody watching knows what you're talking about.
I know, but I just uh yeah, nobody really cares either. That's the unfortunate thing. But yeah, things are moving along on my end somewhat. Don't really have much more to add to that, and I prefer to keep things vague. So unfortunately, don't really have
All
much to
right.
say in terms of being able to hold up a conversation. It's a very strange position to say the least.
Fair enough then. So, do you want to just move into the article? Because I'm sure people are wondering what the hell the title of the stream is about.
Yeah,
We're going to be responding to, well, not just an article, but potentially a series of different articles, because this article is part of a series of articles written on a blog back in 2017. Do you want to explain what it's about, or should I?
yeah. Basically, someone who claims to be an anarcho-capitalist has taken it upon themselves to provide the definitive critique of so-called left libertarianism. And you can see very quickly, both when you read the articles and you see their choice of imagery in their thumbnails, that when they mean left libertarianism, they're not referring to market socialism or any of the other various forms of fake libertarian fake libertarianism. They're clearly attacking the alliance of the libertarian left. Basically, Konkanites, left Rothbardians, people like Esso and I, and their attacks, characterizations, and understandings of the Alliance of the Libertarian Left, as well as our own position, is both absolutely laughable, as well as the extent to which this guy attempts to defend his own position. And you'll see very quickly what we mean as soon as we go into this article. We kind of, I mean, this one was chosen semi arbitrarily, it's a little out of order. As I said before, it's part of a series, but we chose to lead with this one simply because we thought it would be particularly juicy. For those of you who aren't aware, vulgar libertarianism is a term coined by Kevin Carson, if I recall correctly, though I'm sure others might have referred to it in the past, where certain libertarians and certainly other state skeptics will fall into the trap of defending white market firms as they currently exist in society and using that as a model or trying to provide an expectation in defense of a free market in an attempt to explain how it is that certain commodities and certain modes of production will occur in the absence of the state, which is fallacious for multiple reasons, but the most important reason is that it strongly implies to the listener that the white market as it currently exists is an accurate model of how a free society will organize economically, in addition to completely ignoring the extent to which the economy is largely centrally planned indirectly through various market incentives created by the state. And
Well,
the various reasons that this is done, we could probably spend half an hour listing and describing. But the point is that the whole point of identifying vulgar libertarianism is to explain and kind of stigmatize that practice. You were going to say something?
well, yeah, I was just going to say it's not exclusively the white market or the cash nexus as it's also been referred to as. It's also it's also criticizing how certain libertarians approach trying to inform their principles, not just on libertarianism but on any other subject, or defending certain institutions established by the government or certain organizations which are practicing a model that can only exist because state coercion is defending it by giving it certain legal privileges that it doesn't give other firms, or is externalizing its maintenance costs. An example of which would be the enclosure movement. Is it's defended by a lot of vulgar libertarian types. It doesn't necessarily pertain to the white market or the cash nexus, but it's the reason why it's a big part of the reason why cities became a thing back in the mid 19th century, both in Europe and the United States. Except in the United States, it wasn't referred to as the enclosure movement. It was referred to as manifest destiny, but it's essentially the same thing. Point is though that that is oftentimes defended. I've heard it from Shane Killian. I've heard this from Walter Block. The sort of industrial, the sort of industrial economic model is defended as a virtue of the market, but in reality, it's in large part just because of the state's land monopoly and the state stripping people of their property claims.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm just reading the comments right now. Albedo says, "No, Joe Biden. The nuclear codes are not a vending machine."
Oh
Yeah,
God.
for those of you who aren't aware, Joe Biden got inaugurated today as the 40-something president of the United States, and I, for one, am actually looking forward to. I for one am looking forward to seeing how Joe Biden mumbles and stumbles around. There's a not zero chance that he'll simply be pushed out of office so that Kamala Harris can become president, but it's not really that important to me. I just find it's like an amusing sideshow.
Gotta be perfectly honest, I was able to sort of inform an educated guess around the fact that since it's the 20th of January, um, Joe Biden was president. But honestly, I didn't. I'm so tuned out of state media and politics. I wasn't even like definitively sure that that had happened until like an hour ago.
Listen,
And that's not
I'm sorry.
that's I was just gonna say, and that's not a lack of being informed necessarily. It's just because I just fucking can't with these Mockingbird media outlets anymore. Like James Corbett has been documenting this extensively, but what I mean by that is if there is no sense of narrative cohesion anymore. James Corbett has referred to this process as the normalization of doublethink. But I would say it's more like the politicization of reality, where these news narratives sort of
We got a
openly
donor.
contradict.
Sneakers eyes out, filthy
Ooh,
slam
nice.
dunk sneakers into the trash, them filthy gifts. Sneakers swirlies in high school toilet, filthy Goomba stomp sneakers, filthy cleans up the aftermath
Is
of
the
Neger's
donation
dreadlocks as
over?
a mop, Sukaniger, Sukaniger.
Well,
Guess not.
that didn't sound the way Asia intended for that to come out. Sukaniger.
The
So,
text to speech bot must have caught on, but
uh, possibly. Unfortunately, you can't really predict how the text to speech will turn out. But yeah, thank you, Asia, for the $2.
appreciate it. Just what I was saying is that it's more as though there is no sense of narrative cohesion in a logical sense anymore. You can't use reasoning or a coherent line of reasoning to structure together what any of these media outlets are trying to convey anymore. It's just whether or not you have this political allegiance or this political allegiance is going to determine what position you argue for. If you try listening to any of them from a sort of anti-political perspective, or where you're not feeling as though you're attached to one of the state's political allegiances, or you don't buy into the idea that policy determines your interests, it's nonsense. They openly contradict themselves. Like I've noticed this several times within a single segment. And that's when these pundits aren't, these mockingbird media outlets aren't openly arguing against the concept of trying to reason through a narrative. Like, for instance, the trust the science or back the blue talking points openly promote the idea you should just turn your brain off and identify with these things, not because they make sense, but just because that's what your political allegiance is doing. So I can't listen to any of these outlets for more than minute to minute and a half increments anymore, and even doing that is torture.
And it's gotten so
So
bad. It's gotten so bad that even other Mockingbird media outlets are starting to identify it. I remember actually seeing Tucker Carlson because it happened to be on, and he pointed out that suddenly a lot of mainstream media outlets who were just a couple months ago uh, talking talking about how and bringing on guests discussing how the police are racist and how the police need to be defunded are after the Capitol Hill quote unquote insurrection, which by the way was probably the most soy insurrection I think I've ever seen in world history. They've suddenly changed their tune. They've become hashtag back the blue.
yeah, and of course you got to wear a mask. Not wearing a mask is literally killing people. Until the WHO claims the opposite and retroactively changes their previous statements as though they never happened, and justifies this with the reasoning that, oh, well, that was just a noble lie, and we're not expected to bat an eyelid at that. Yeah, I can't do it. um, that's the other reason why I don't really make reaction videos anymore, is because in order to do that, I have to kind of dip my toes into mainstream political discussion, and fuck that. I'm not even remotely interested.
I like JC Armitage. We should refer to 1/6 as the insurrection.
The insurrection.
And I've heard the term referring to it as 1/6 thrown around as well. People are comparing what happened in Capitol Hill on the 6th of January this month
To a
as
museum tour guide.
pretty much, though, what people are comparing it to, like one of the most tragic events in America since 9/11, or even since American history. and people refer to, of course, the attack on the World Trade Center as 9/11 in reference to the date, and so calling the Capitol Hill insurrection as 1/6 is being thrown around as kind of a way to mock that. Although I kind of like the insurrection. I think I'm gonna refer to it as that from now on. If you want
I agree.
if you want a perfect image that encapsulates why the insurrection was just so pathetic, there's just one video of the people who stormed the Capitol entering the building and staying within the velvet rope.
Yeah, it's functionally identical to a museum tour guide. That's why I make that comparison. Being led around by police escorts, people having no intention of actually going over the velvet ropes, taking pictures and selfies with certain artifacts inside. To call that an insurrection is yeah, it's something. It's kind of funny that a lot of the people who attempt to point to that as as an action that's produced meaningful political change are also the same people who would try and argue that means and ends consistency it doesn't exist, and mock people for treating the state as an institution with a set of interests, trying to identify those interests and looking for ways to undermine its ability to sustain those interests.
Sorry, I'm somewhere else right now. But
That's perfectly fine.
now, what's this about? Sorry, I'm just reading the comments. Derek Johnson asks, since 9/11, really, that's freaking stretching it. Yes, yes, it is. But you listen to mainstream media talking about it. You watch CNN, NBC, anyone. They'll call it an insurrection. They'll call it like one of the most horrific and tragic events in American history, certainly in the last 100 years. And so, you know what happened in the last 100 years, easily within that window? Literally 9/11.
Within
So,
the last fucking 6 months, people were setting cities on fire, and those same media outlets were doing damage control for them.
mhm. Oh, and Albedo is also pointing something out as well. Iran apparently is experiencing massive blackouts, and they're blaming it on people mining cryptocurrency.
Yeah, okay.
I don't,
Totally how that works.
I don't, I don't. I mean, I understand that crypto miners use a lot of electricity, but I mean, what percentage of Iran's power grid is really being consumed by cryptocurrency?
Yeah, it's not. There's actually an article written on, I think it's coindesk.com. I don't remember the title of it, but it refutes the sort of crypto electricity myth pretty soundly, because people have this idea that crypto mining, um it's as though it just sort of you just gradually need more and more electricity in order to fuel it. And this has been used in past years as a way to try and fuel climate alarmism, by pointing to crypto mining as something to be scared of. But
Well,
yeah, this that's not how that works, and I'll make sure and link the article at some point during the stream or
mhm,
after for the people who join the Discord or are in the Discord.
mhm. Now, anyways, I think we should go ahead and get started with the article because we're almost 20 minutes in.
Yeah.
So,
In Defense of Vulgar Libertarianism by We the Individuals from We the Individuals. That's the name of the blog on liberty.me. But to clarify, I'm not entirely sure whether or not this was was written by a single author because this particular blog is hosted by a group of different people. Jeff Peterson II, Chris Calton, Blaine Kelly, Henry Moore, Matt Tanuous, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, probably am, and Rocco Stanzoni. Probably didn't pronounce that correctly either, but
it's Italian, so probably Stanzoni.
I knew it was Italian. That's why I assumed that it's not an E, but like an E as in the E's pronounced.
Mm-hmm.
But let's get into the article now. Part of an anarcho-capitalist case against left libertarianism. I guess I'll say right off the bat, though, that when I first saw this, because I've been trying to get around to this article for months, or this series of articles, I am kind of intrigued by the prospect of people attempting to respond to the arguments made by left Rothbardians and agorists, which, for the record, is simply arguing the exact same principles that would be promoted by Rothbardians, but from an Aristotelian perspective. So using an Aristotelian logical framework to inform their epistemology and their method of analysis, as opposed to the thin libertarians who try to operate around inductive or deontological logical frameworks.
All right. So, anyways,
that's literally the only disagreement in terms of actually what informs their positions between these two camps. So keep that in mind as we read this. But because I've seen nobody else even attempt to address that, I was kind of intrigued by this article. So let's see if it's well, I already know, but we'll see if they actually A, address our position, and B, satisfy our skepticism towards vulgar libertarianism.
Anyways,
Anyway,
I'll read the first two paragraphs. One difficult aspect of living as a libertarian in a less than free society is that we cannot describe to our opponents with absolute certainty how a genuinely free market would work or would look. We are left to rely on thought experiments and the examples of existing business models to compare to the state. If I want to discuss how state intervention raises the cost of healthcare, for example, I may compare it to the cell phone industry, which must do the opposite in order to compete in the marketplace. Should we reach a conclusion that the higher prices are the result of government, assuming we want lower healthcare costs, then we definitively don't want socialized healthcare, which cannot provide any final or ongoing solution.
Well, the first issue here is that this isn't necessarily something we would disagree on. It's just that no one here except I've seen thin libertarians attempt to do exactly this, and that's kind of my biggest issue with them. I'll get into in a moment. But you absolutely can point to certain models of organization and demonstrate using the praxeological method of analysis that they would not be able to exist without certain functions of the state, privileging firms that try and operate around them, or externalizing their maintenance costs, because you could point to certain things, certain behaviors that they engage in, or certain incentives that they have, which rely upon state coercion, and therefore can reason that without that state institution or that coercion, these organizations would have to operate around a different model, or would have to adapt through market means. And but definitely a society free of state coercion is an empirical reality, However, we can definitively point to, say, the wage system or sweatshops, and point to all the things that the state has to do in order to sustain these models, or just point to certain economic incentives that we can demonstrate, such that these are inconsistent or incompatible with. For example, the consumer side of the labor market. If really the labor market was being informed by consumer preference as well as the producer's preference, then there shouldn't be a system. In fact, there shouldn't be a sort of prescribed system, uh, where application prices can be present. The fact that application prices are present themselves suggests some degree of economic planning. And in fact, there is. There's the financial system, which all white market firms have to operate around, which is influenced by the Federal Reserve, the Department of Justice, and various international financial cartels. There is the way that supply enters into local economies being decided by groups like the World Trade Organization, which is backed by state coercion. Their ability to sort of monopolize supply chains like that is the direct result of land monopolization in other nations by other governments, and etc. So we know, as a matter of fact, or at the very least, we have enough things to point to that would suggest to us that absent these systems, there's no real reason to suspect that that economic activity could look like this in the absence of the state.
Yeah, not really. I was just going to comment on the first paragraph, how they're kind of coming at this problem from the exact wrong way, because they're trying to claim that being a libertarian in a less than free society, which is just to say a statist society, means they can't just point to certain models and certain forms of organization as examples of their ideas in practice, which one showcases the extreme limits of their imagination, because there are lots of ways in which people engage in economic activity in the absence of government coercion all the time. We call these gray markets. Sure, they're not nearly as common as they should be, and they're largely disincentivized against for various reasons that we've talked about before. But you're also coming at this from the wrong perspective, because it's really not unique to libertarianism. Any model or anyone proposing anything that's even remotely different from the status quo, whether you're a libertarian or a socialist or someone who unironically believes that English socialism from 1984 is something desirable, you're necessarily going to not be able to point to something that exists in modern day society as an example. So I don't even know why you would bring that up. It's a
Well, it
very
also
strange. It's a very strange argument to bring up. Sorry.
It's also interesting because it insinuates from the start that ethical framework, or the correct way to see ethics, is as a sort of prescribed system that people conduct their behaviors around, rather than a means of looking at a means of looking at the way that actors interact with one another, and being able to point to actions that they engage in which are or are not justified. And it also assumes a structuralist interpretation of society, where in order to have a society, you need to have norms that are sort of either prescribed to actors in society, or which operate outside of human action. Which, on top of the fact that this is something that the left the left libertarian, so to speak, methodology or a lens of analysis would object to turning that into a statement of begging the question from the start, because you're assuming that you're assuming that you're assuming something to just be undisputed, which absolutely is in dispute. In fact, that's an understatement. That's that's the entire core of our disagreement with you. But yeah, the other problem that this introduces is of course the notion that there could be something like a quote unquote rule of law in the absence of a state, or that a society just in general, in order to be a free society, you need to have these weird prescriptive ethical systems that exist, and that's we've gone over the problems with that in previous streams. But briefly, it completely negates the libertarian premise of free will. But it also but what it also does is I'm sorry, I lost my I lost my train of thought. But we've gone over the problems with prescriptive ethical systems before. So do you want to elaborate?
I was kind of going to go into it a different point, which is just to kind of mock the idea that a libertarian ought to go into a prescriptive model or try to explain a prescriptive model for how production, how distribution, and how all of these things ought to be performed. I think I've done a video like a year ago, probably older, about how it is that libertarianism must necessarily begin from the premise of rational humility, that nobody in any society ever throughout history, and no collection of geniuses throughout history, is ever going to be able to know how best to do certain things, how best to produce a certain commodity, how best to produce a certain class of commodities, where they should go, who values them most readily, especially considering that what is the most valuable use of those resources is going to shift dynamically from moment to moment. So it's not even going to be a question of a lack of computing power. You can have a literal matryoshka brain, a star that has been converted entirely into a computer, and such a thing would not be able to determine or figure out the best way to do any of that stuff, because all of those variables are constantly shifting from moment to moment, from whim to whim, because you essentially have hundreds, thousands, millions, even potentially billions of moral agents all making decisions based on arbitrary whims at any given moment. It's absolutely ludicrous to think that somehow attempting to articulate freedom and doing so through arguing for a prescriptive top-down model of economic organization is ever going to result in anything except just confusion and mayhem in the rhetorical sense. But to go into the problem of a prescriptive model of an economy, I mean, we talked numerous times before about how there is no one economy, how every interaction is its own economy, how every household, street, city, region, and a continent is going to have its own economy. And so attempting to prescribe that from the top down is just going to not only result in a whole bunch of confusion, but simply the ability to do so in the first place necessarily presupposes that the ones that are imposing their top-down preferences for how people ought to organize, they're attempting to make a claim of property that is superior to the actual owners of said property. To essentially plan something, you necessarily need to exercise dominion over it. But so far, they would not be able to do so. Any claim that they would make is therefore illegitimate, and for that reason can never be done on the basis of knowledge. It's entirely random at best, and entirely disconnected from anything that resembles reality. You were going to say something?
I was just going to say that's the reason why oftentimes people who follow Lockman's analysis of Austrian methodology and left Rothbardians will point to the financial industry or the labor market, because these are markets which intersect with a vast area of a vast number of markets, a vast number of specialized interests. For one, the labor market, if we were to take this approach, if we were to take the praxeological approach, the labor market, or say the lumber industry, should not be the same as the labor market for steel working in a given area. You know, just to think of two examples off the top of my head. But something we damn sure know couldn't exist in the absence of state intervention would be for the labor market for the lumber industry in, say, Boise, Idaho, to be the same as the labor market for the lumber industry in actually in a part of the country where there actually is an active lumber industry, the northern part of Idaho, for instance. So, and those are the sort of problems that you run into when you look at the current political economy, that you can point to and say, hey, it's kind of weird that it works that way, given that everything that the Austrian methodology tells us about economics should indicate that it doesn't work this way. And yet there's no conceivable reason that they should work this way. And if you look deeper into it, the concept of industry runs into of political industry itself runs into a couple of incentive problems. But just what I was going to add about what I was going to add to what I was saying about ethics earlier is the concept of prescriptive ethics run into a series of problems. The first being that if behavior is informed by ethical principles, and nothing really informs ethical principles, and ethical principles aren't really a guide for explaining what is just interactions between moral agents, well, then human action, or how people interact with one another, becomes arbitrary, because there's nothing informing what ethical principles are. If you accept that something has to inform ethical principles, or more specifically, what an ethical society would be, well, then you have to start looking at what your ethical principles entail, and then you start running into problems with, say, the wage system, because the wage system is held up by coercive state intervention. It's not necessarily that that employers and employees are engaging. One is engaging in a coercive act of violence against another. It's that both of them are being coerced by the state and political institutions, because such organizations have constructed barriers to entry which force them into that position.
Yeah, I don't really have much more to add to that. Let me see here. I'm just reading this over one more time. Yeah, I don't really think we have much more to add in regards to these two paragraphs. Should we continue?
Sure.
All right. Did I go?
I mean, I had more to say, but I have a feeling that this is not going to be the first time we see this issue. So I can just add what else I had in mind the next time that this argument pops up, or that this problem pops up.
Mm-hmm. Anyways, I'm just going to go ahead and read the next two paragraphs. Unfortunately, we don't live with a free market, and indeed, The state plays a role in every industry, including the ones mentioned above. We don't have any perfect or pristine examples. As a result, some defenses of freer markets, which are in fact not pure laissez-faire free markets, are criticized as vulgar libertarianism by libertarians on the left, namely Kevin Carson and others at the left market anarchist think tank, the Center for a Stateless Society, C4SS. Vulgar
No, that's
libertarianism.
a straw man argument.
I mean, I'm not
The
sure. I'm not even sure that I understand the argument they're even trying to make in the first paragraph.
what they're essentially trying to insinuate, or the argument that they're attempting to establish, is that the only way that you can the only way that you could demonstrate free market principles is by pointing to imperfect models, which, first of all, that's not an ethical argument, and vulgar libertarianism, as we mentioned at the beginning of the stream, specifically addresses problems with ethics. How thin libertarian types like Walter Block or the political libertarians inform their idea of ethical principles. But also, that's not even necessarily, if we're looking at this from the economic perspective, which for whatever reason the author felt like he had to jump into suddenly there without without making note of that. Definitely not a bait and switch fallacy. But even if we were to take this on face value, that's not even the Austrian method anymore. I mean, sure, Mises has point. You can point to imperfect economic models to demonstrate your principles, or to sort of, not to demonstrate, but to use as an example of your principles. Mises himself did this a few times with, say, the evenly rotating economy, something which Mises himself argued is not actually it's not meant to realistically represent an economy. But he's not using this to demonstrate his point. He's using this just as an example to, in a Wittgensteinian sense, make it easier for other people to understand what he's talking about by allowing them to sort of paint a picture in their head of what's going on. It's not the crux of actually demonstrating the Austrian position is fundamentally a priori, and doesn't treat models and doesn't treat prescriptive modeling as though it's a valid approach to informing your economic principles. In fact, that's kind of the entire point of the Austrian methodology. That's the fundamental. That's the foundational claim of epistemology which Austrians are making. Is that since you're studying people, you can't create models to try and demonstrate what their patterns of behavior are going to be, because you can't. It's not even conceivably possible to prescribe what people are going to do. So the better way to try and explain economic activity is to understand how people's incentives work and how they act on those incentives. Then use that to understand what's going on in lived reality.
My thinking is that, once I think I'm starting to get what he's trying to say in the first paragraph, and unfortunately, I think it's even worse than we realize.
I don't doubt it.
Yeah.
I mean, just looking over that a few times, I didn't even really notice the presumption of prescriptive modeling at first until you started pointing it out.
Mm-hmm. Now,
what did you realize?
He's coming to realize that his own attempts at his own ability to defend libertarianism is ultimately dependent on prescriptive models, and trying to convince people that the consequences of those prescriptive models are necessarily superior. But what he's realizing is that because no perfect examples exist or could exist, that he is therefore at a significant disadvantage and that it's not going to be a very persuasive or useful argument for libertarianism at all. He's realizing that his own ability to defend libertarianism is incredibly flawed. Now, this could be a very useful tool for him, a very revelatory moment where he could just be like, yeah, maybe my argument isn't so good. I should probably try to research other defenses of these ideas and see if there aren't any different approaches because this one is clearly flawed. But no, the conclusion he seems to come to is that it's good enough. It's good enough. It's the other people that are the problem.
At some point in the article, I bet you $5, he's probably going to say something along the lines of, "It's not perfect, but it's pragmatic."
Oh, I mean, I think that's a very, very safe bet.
Because this type of argument tends to be the sort of the pretext for making a case like that. Which, for those who aren't familiar, because I haven't done a bad take shorts video on pragmatism yet, even though I have every intention on doing so. It's actually a thinly veiled appeal to relativism. Because the problem is that there is no such thing as a pragmatic position. And in fact, if you look at essentially any time that pragmatism is appealed to, it's usually because someone has run out of arguments to even try and logically justify a case that they're making, and therefore have to resort to relativism in order to even continue trying. But yeah, the problem is that since it's a relative, specifically it's relativism in regards to praxis. It's a type of praxis relativism. The problem is again, if there's nothing informing your principles, then you're not demonstrating anything, because what you're claiming isn't really founded on anything. So a Marxist, for instance, could just as easily make whatever claim that you're arguing in exactly the same way that you're proposing it, that you're framing it as a justification for state socialism.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why you see, if you listen to statist arguments for more than 5 minutes about their rationale for political models or problems with state violence, you'll almost certainly see within the first 5 minutes the pragmatism argument pop up somewhere.
Yeah, that seems about right. Anyways, I'm going to go ahead and read the next paragraph. Vulgar libertarianism, as C4SS describes it, refers to those who treat the existing marketplace as one which closely approximates how a freed market would look. So, for instance, if I were to praise all the great things that the free market provides using the iPhone as an example, I would be guilty of vulgar libertarianism because Apple is part of the existing marketplace and benefits from state intervention such as patent laws and other forms of intellectual property. Yes.
So you would be you would be guilty of it not because you're appealing to the technology, but because you're appealing to, say, Apple, or the reason that it exists, or the systems that it exists within, as though that's a product of the free market, which is the case that you would be making. That's what your argument entails.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not. Therefore, it's vulgar libertarianism.
Mm-hmm. Now, what's interesting is that you're trying to. The problem with vulgar libertarianism is that it creates an equivocation between the existing marketplace and a freed market, which is exactly why the term vulgar libertarianism was coined, to explain just how fallacious that kind of understanding is. And it doesn't seem like this guy, our author here, is going to explain the difference between the modern marketplace and the freed market. If he were able to do this, then he would be able to wrap up his point in a nice little bow and be able to put us, so-called left libertarians, in our place. But I have a feeling he's not going to be able to do this. So just to clarify what I mean, our null hypothesis is that if he can demonstrate that there is an equivalency between a freed market and the marketplace as it currently exists in the United States, then he will have successfully refuted us.
Not necessarily. It's more if he can demonstrate that there's a way to argue for libertarian conclusions, or really any conclusion for that matter, without without having a coherent epistemology or methodological lens of analysis. Then you'll have refuted us, because it's kind of the entire the entire point of the that's the entire foundation of the left Rothbardian position, is just that, hey, you're making specific claims about reality. In order for those to be informative, there must be things which entail these principles in order for them to actually convey meaning and refute things like political authority, or the notion that moral agency doesn't exist, and all of these things that are required in order for a libertarian claim against political authority to be coherent, to be understandable from person to person. But yeah, the other thing that this does is it creates a and this is kind of the biggest problem here, is it essentially makes the case that the iPhone is specifically a product of the systems being described, which is how a lot of thin libertarian types take it. In fact, a very common counter argument Heretic and I, and no doubt any of the other fellow agorists watching the stream have received from Hoppians or party types, is that without these prescriptive policy models created by the state, there would be no way to coordinate production that requires a large scale, or quote unquote requires a large scale operation. So it is very much a recreation of the the framework where the state needs to exist to create the roads. And it's sad to see a lot of people fall into this trap, because I don't think that this is I don't think that a lot of people who fall into that line of thinking about libertarianism do it intentionally. It's just the most widely available approach to libertarianism, so it's typically the kind that a lot of people find themselves encountering first, and sort of agreeing with, because there is a clear foundation in reality that these arguments have. It's just that because this treats libertarianism as a policy position or a political allegiance, where to be libertarian, you have to identify with these models. That causes the same cognitive dissonance that statists experience when arguing against libertarians in general, because when you're arguing against the sort of deontological position, or you're arguing against structuralism, you're undermining their narrative of how societies are informed. And a terrible thing about the human mind is that when one's perception of reality is challenged, it goes into instinctively a sort of defense mechanism to try and protect that. But that's what most people refer to as cognitive dissonance. And that's what we're seeing here, I think.
Yeah, it looks to be the case. Now, anyways, let's go ahead and continue. Why don't you read off the next 2 paragraphs?
Okay. There are several ways to approach vulgar libertarianism, quoted in quotes, and left libertarians, including but not limited to Kevin Carson, oscillate between one way that's helpful and another way that isn't. The first way, a progressive statist points out a phenomenon in the existing economy that he or she thinks is problematic, then an oftentimes somewhat inexperienced libertarian, in parentheses, defends that phenomenon on the premise that if it arose within a free market, it would be efficient and have resulted from a series of mutually beneficial exchanges that improved human well-being. A more discerning and seasoned libertarian would point out in many cases that the phenomenon the leftist is referring to in fact resulted from rent-seeking and legal plunder, and is therefore something that libertarians should not ignore or defend, but instead clarify the causes of, given that this only takes some long-term familiarity with a libertarian outlook and would not be unique to the libertarian left. What the fuck are you talking about? It absolutely, especially in the case of rent-seeking, that is something Hoppians would call you a commie for pointing out that this is something that's an incentive defended by the state in most economies.
There are several ways. I'm just thinking of this first paragraph because it ends with the saying that there's one way that's helpful. There's one way to approach vulgar libertarianism that's helpful and one way that isn't. Now, the way that it isn't is put in the latter, suggests that the more discerning and seasoned libertarian in the middle of the second paragraph is therefore insinuated to be the unhelpful way. And I'm very curious as to why that is, because this explanation for how it is that something that is problematic in the current economy being a result of rent-seeking and legal plunder is not only very convincing, but it's also a very good explanation of, things that actually happen in the economy today, the extent to which the state distorts incentives and prescribes certain economic activity to occur on the basis of how it benefits politicians and state agents individually as well as a class. So I'm kind of curious as to, maybe I'm making maybe I'm jumping to conclusions here, but I would very much like to know if that is the way to approach vulgar libertarianism that the author is determining to be unhelpful, how it's not helpful.
Yeah, and that's actually what that's what question I was about to ask, is since they're arguing against the concept of entailed principles informing what your claim about reality is, I would be interested in seeing how this person is going to rationalize one of these claims being, or one of these explanations of states distorting the market, how that's helpful, but how the other one isn't. And I have a feeling that this is probably where we're going to see the pragmatic argument pop its ugly head in this article. But yeah, there doesn't seem to be any notable difference, but we'll go on and see. Do you want to read the next section, or should I again?
I'll go ahead because I am very curious as to which one's the unhelpful one. That clarification,
okay, I am as well.
Yeah. That clarification can offer a valuable service that strengthens arguments which various schools of libertarianism will advance, including libertarian Austrian economists, public choice theorists, as well as left libertarians. This is the positive way to approach the issue. When the left points out an alleged problem with existing business, it is both rhetorically ineffective and analytically mistaken, for the most part, to simply defend whatever is happening on the assumption that it's taking place in a free market. Instead, we should look at what is causing the avowed problem and point out whatever role state intervention might play in causing it. This allows for a more accurate analysis and more sympathetic and productive interaction with leftists and populists. I have a feeling he's about to pull the rug out from under us. I'm just saying, because honestly, this particular paragraph is not terrible at all. In fact, it's actually pretty decent.
Except it insinuates that they're the ones who are the people who are skeptical of left libertarians are the ones who are they're the only ones who are looking at what roles state intervention play in causing these problems that don't immediately appear as though they're products of state intervention. And woo lad, that's projection that could be seen on the moon.
Anyways, I'm just gonna go ahead and go to the next paragraph because, just from the first few words in the next paragraph, it looks like he's about to pull the rug out from under us. Anyways, however, left libertarians engage in erroneous argumentation when they slam other libertarians as vulgar or insincere for praising the existing market. Yet, because state influence is so pervasive, many on the libertarian left oppose big business wholesale. What?
You're going to have to be a bit more specific in regards to what you're talking about. We've already given several examples of how the political economy specifically, as well as how property claims, as prescribed by the state, cannot be justified within a libertarian framework. And in fact, arguments for libertarianism entail rejecting these things. So, yeah, I feel that this is a composition. This is going to be a composition fallacy.
Possibly, but just reading the first few words in the next paragraph, we're about to have some fun here. You go ahead and read it.
All right. What of Walmart's work in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, for instance? Carson and left libertarians would be wrong and probably engaging in a bit of derailing to dismiss that on the basis of state-granted benefits that Walmart enjoys, a firm can benefit from state intervention and still operate on good knowledge and incentives. This can allow firms like Walmart to resolve problems which many people falsely assume that the state is needed to remedy. Oh no. Oh no. This just went from 0 to shit really quickly.
I don't even know where to begin.
First of all, if people like Kevin Carson were to criticize Walmart's work in New Orleans or the state's work in the affected areas after Hurricane Katrina, it would not be on the basis that there are just organizations being directed to go in there and provide relief. It would be what that relief entails, or the fact that there are organizations like the Cajun Navy, for instance, or Food Not Bombs, who also try to help regions affected by storms that have experienced millions of dollars in property damage, and the state uses violence to kick them out. And of course, what counts as disaster relief in many cases is also kind of questionable. Like, for instance, police throwing bleach on homeless people's food because they didn't get it from approved vendors.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just elsewhere at the moment.
I'm sorry for the dead air. I was expecting Heretic to say something there, but a firm can benefit for state intervention and still operate on good knowledge and incentives. So this is literally just the type of argument that statists employ when they're criticized on ethical grounds, or in terms of economic principle about some claims that they're making about the government. Um, the post office isn't a monopoly, even though it functionally controls commerce. It's not a monopoly used by the state to control rates at which commerce are delivered. No, it's just an organization which was set up to help people in rural communities. Minimum wage isn't a eugenicist plan to try and eliminate certain groups they saw as being undesirable. No, it's empowering and giving workers dignity.
Yeah.
They're not even arguing against bless you. They're not even arguing against our position at this point. They're just trying to reframe uh, examples of. They're just trying to reframe white market activity in a really disingenuous framework where it attempts to put us in the position of trying to make an argument which we're not making.
Mm-hmm.
You're not defending. If you're going to defend the white market in this instance, you are not the person who's trying to say that organizations should go into Hurricane Katrina, because for one, disaster relief can and regularly is provided by mutual aid organizations, and two, there's no reason, even given by you, but definitely no reason to assume in any framework that only the state would be able to go into these areas. That's the position you're trying to defend. Why the state should have a monopoly on disaster relief, and why it doesn't matter what we're considering as disaster relief. Even though things like FEMA barges exist, which are kind of, yikesy.
Now, I'm reminded of, you remember the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico like 10 years ago-ish? Don't remember the exact year. But yeah, I remember that was a big thing, oil spill, big ecological disaster. There were a whole bunch of mutual aid organizations and even private organizations that had their own ships with their own technology, including like this massive, massive barge that was paid off and going to be brought in from the UK or somewhere in Europe. It was going to be brought in, and it was going to be like the biggest oil cleanup barge ever deployed ever. And the United States government specifically went out of their way to stop private organizations and mutual aid groups from going in and helping assist the cleanup, which only goes to showcase exactly what you were talking about earlier, where the U.S. government, just governments in general, are always going to try to have a monopoly on disaster relief. It goes without saying that understanding this, the only reason that Walmart was able to go in the first place is because that they got government permission. Now, how they got it, I'm not entirely sure, but it's safe to assume that it was a favor from some politician or some state agents to their friends in Walmart in an attempt to give them some extremely good PR.
Yeah, which is ultimately, if we were to look into this, the fact that they had sort of a monopoly on doing that insinuates that this was the case in and of itself, because that means that they had to have some sort of political favor, no matter what it was. But this is the exact same dumbass argument that the only person on this channel who has the Voldemort rule tried to make in a video that they made on left libertarianism. The Voldemort rule being that they shall not be named. Walmart gives people wage work, and wage work is how people make a living. That should be lauded. No, we are not the ones who are arguing that people can't make a living. In fact, you're the one who's trying to defend the system that makes it so people can only make their living in a handful of different ways because of state coercion and the cash nexus. That's the position you have to defend. If you're going to defend the white market, and you're going to defend application pricing and all these other terrible interventions into the market that the state creates.
Mm-hmm. And now
not us who are arguing that economies form from the bottom up around consumer preferences, i.e., what literally every Austrian economist who has any sort of notable influence in Austrian circles has previously. Aside from Hoppe, because he's not an Austrian economist, he's a Marxist who parades himself around as an Austro-libertarian. Anyway, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was just going to. I can't help but be struck by this sentence right here that I'm highlighting. You can't see it as though it's the firm. It's the one that says a firm can benefit from state intervention and still operate on good knowledge. Yeah. The only I don't know how really to explain my reaction to that except no duh. It goes without saying that any firm that is going to be operating on the basis of any firm ever that is going to exist is that benefits from state intervention is going to operate on some good knowledge and some good incentives at some point in its existence. I mean, I don't understand how or why you would bring that up, because that kind of just sounds so controversial. It almost comes off as condescending.
Well, yeah, why? What are we considering good knowledge, I guess, is a question that I could ask. Because I think that this is an attempt to try and gloss over something that various people like Roderick Long and Kevin Carson have highlighted, that firms that benefit from political privilege suffer from various forms of information problem that firms without these privileges wouldn't suffer from, because they don't have to take into consideration costs that other firms would have to, and therefore are missing some important context in calculating their sort of internal pricing, their internal profit loss. So, or trying to study how the market around them works, because they don't have to interact with the market as much as other firms do. A lot of more of this is done through internal management, and that makes things even worse, because the more internal bureaucracy a firm has, the more difficult it is to even convey information. So, and I think that that's what they're attempting to address. And first of all, that's a completely different argument, but it's also a much more nuanced argument than just addressing one sentence to. And I'm hoping that the author's not doing that, because that would be pretty pathetic, honestly, especially since that point is just expanding on arguments that Hayek and Mises have made. The information problems in economic calculation. But yeah, should we continue?
Yeah, 1 second. Without capitalism, that is, private ownership of the means of production, many technological and industrial innovations would have never come about. Without corporatism, the same companies that provide those innovations might accrue less wealth, or without the state, they would probably be richer, but we have no way to know for sure. The point is that many on the libertarian left go overboard and apply the above insight in apply the above insight in a way which rejects reasonable economic analysis and serves knee-jerk leftism.
Yeah, so there's a whole host of problems here. First of all,
where do you begin? Where do you begin?
Yeah, first of all, this is engaging in a fallacious debate tactic that, as far as I've seen, Shane has been the only one to highlight. He refers to as the microcosm fallacy. This is where the causal explanation, or supposedly the reason that you're attempting to claim something has taken place or some observation has been made, is tied to some explanation or some rationale that doesn't really logically follow, or there's no real reason given why that conclusion follows from that rationale. Which, of course, is a problem, and this right here is a problem that inductive logic particularly is prone to, since principles, as noted, are not informed by things that entail them, like certain claims about methodology or epistemology. Rather, they're just sort of informed by what happens when you crudely mash them together with other principles. The nature of them is determined by what you get when you do that. And this is sort of one of the problems that creates, is there's no coherent basis for arguing sort of from an analytic perspective why something is demonstrably true. And this is kind of the point that we're making, is we're asking, well, why exactly are these vulgar libertarian or thin libertarian assumptions? How can they be true if, in order to argue for the libertarian position, these things have to be entailed, which tell us that these conclusions can't be justified? But yeah, there are a lot more. I'm assuming by Jesus Christ, you're right. There are too many issues here to even know where to start. I guess I made a good shot at starting.
It's
there's of course.
It's kind of overwhelming. I mean, I will say this. I will give props to the author for actually providing a definition of capitalism. That is something that, as I'm sure regular viewers of the stream are aware, is extraordinarily rare. And of course, we can go into whether or not that they, how do they know that their definition of capitalism is correct?
That's not even the main problem here. I mean, that is, of course, a problem. Is sure, a definition's been provided, but it's not really informative, because that's just a description. There's no real attempt to explain why is this all part of a sort of all-encompassing concept. But private ownership, what are we talking about when, like, what property ethic are we referring to when we talk about private ownership? Are we talking about logical positivism? Are we talking about occupation-based ownership? Are we talking about Lockean ownership? Are we talking about Rothbardian? There are so many different. That's the problem with just saying something is private, therefore it's good, which is another trope in vulgar libertarianism, is that because you don't have an informed idea of what private ownership is, why it's justified, or necessarily what the nature of it is, you run into this issue with not being able to explain why, for example, the Federal Reserve isn't justified. It isn't something that could be part of a free society, because, after all, it's a private organization. Legally speaking, it's a private organization. Why does legally recognized private ownership, why is it more or less justified than just homesteading a plot of land and saying this is private land? And what counts as homesteading? What justifies homesteading? But and a means of production's even worse, because what are you talking about there? Are you talking about, first of all, in what framework are we attempting to justify um, a means of production? Are we talking about a factory? What would that and what economy are we talking about? Um, Means of production is so innocuous that it could literally be uh, it could literally be anything, given that what counts as private ownership could be decided by the state unilaterally, and what counts as means of production could be anything. This could be a defense for the state seizing property here under the grounds of libertarianism. And this is where a lot of, especially Hoppians, go. They don't call it a state, but obviously a CC is a state. The CC can just seize property, or a less controversial example, you can have punitive arbitration services in the absence of a state, which can kidnap people and force them into like a court service against their will, as opposed to them deciding their own arbitration, or it being handled between the victim, the aggressor, or someone that's considered to be by the particular local economy a trustable voice or a trustable arbiter. But
there is one other thing as well. This sentence right here: without corporatism, the same companies that provide those innovations might accrue less wealth. I mean, is this so-called anarcho-capitalist really defending corporatism here? Like, really? Is this like peak thin? Is this peak thin libertarianism?
Yeah, peak thin. This is peak thin libertarianism. I thought that Lew Rockwell defending slavery was peak thin libertarianism, but and I don't mean slavery as in like the state limits people's options, therefore they technically don't have a choice to work for a handful of politically connected firms. I mean, there's an article from the old periodical that Rothbard and Lew Rockwell published in the 90s, literally where he's defending slavery as in owning another human being as property. But we'll have to talk more about that another time. Yeah, this is so I don't know if you could beat defending slavery as a type of property, but yeah, this is peak libertarianism, peak thin libertarianism, or very close to peak thin libertarianism.
I mean,
without state.
Sorry.
What were you gonna say?
I was just going to say that the institution of slavery, as it existed in the antebellum South, was very much a form of corporatism, insofar as the government state governments heavily subsidized plantation owners, both directly and indirectly. Especially like if slaves were to run away, the state governments would conscript white farmers or white independent farmers, just like white people in general, to go on slave hunts, which is kind of ironic when you really think about it. The state enslaving people to catch slaves.
Using slaves to catch slaves, yeah. But yeah, what are we even talking about at this point when we're referring to wealth? Because if the state is, keep in mind, the only two things that the state can do is either seize resources from people or create use violence to create barriers to entry which stop people from being able to use their resources in certain ways without being harassed. So, given that those are the only two things that the state can do, why is it even coherent to argue that firms can make less wealth unless we're talking about people whose positions only exist, whose firms only exist, whose models of operation that they're sort of organizing their firm around only exists because of political privilege. I mean, and this would also only make sense to talk about wealth like this if we're talking about it in the Malthusian sense, where it's just resources are static, and if you have more, then you have like a bigger slice of the pie, and because of that, other people have less. As opposed to how non-clowns understand resources. Resources being how you utilize information and the number of different ways you can specialize with scarce resources.
I like the way you put that, non-clowns.
Yeah, because people who actually understand any aspect of the Austrian theory, or just, I don't even think monetarists are this retarded. They try and pretend that they don't, like where they try and pretend that they can justify things like Say's law, but it's kind of obvious that they can't. Yeah, if the scarcity of a resource or how valuable, so to speak, it is informed by the amount of ways that you can use it, then it doesn't really have anything to do with the sort of innate property of that resource itself. If you have a stick, for instance, the stick's not very useful, but if you know 20 different things that you can do with the stick, well, then for the person that can do 20 different things with it, that stick is it's a lot more valuable. It's that person is a lot more wealthy because they have something they can do a lot more things with, even though it's the same resource that the other person has access to.
Mm-hmm.
So the person who wrote this article doesn't even really seem to understand that concept. But and without barriers to entry, with this being the case, it's absolutely absurd to argue from any perspective, but especially from an Austrian libertarian perspective, that without these barriers to entry and without these sort of political incentives that are created to privilege some actors at the expense of others, it would be absurd to argue that a society without those things wouldn't be as wealthy or that a society with those things would have people wealthier than the alternative, because everybody or more people would have more access to a greater number of resources and would be able to specialize with their resources in a greater amount of ways, absent these barriers to entry. But also, as noted earlier, economies couldn't operate around application pricing models. So economies would be more local and more localized, and as a result, you really can't argue that a society without a state would necessarily operate around one model or another, but for sure that the only types of models that could really exist are ones that could operate around local economies, like networks, for instance, or mutual aid services.
Now, there is one other thing I'm noticing that I found particularly interesting, and that is combining the sentence without corporatism, companies might accrue less wealth, and then complaining in the last sentence about how the libertarian left rejects reasonable economic analysis. Is corporatism desirable, therefore? Because it seems to me that this guy is overtly recommending government, when it serves
Heretic, it's
to allow
valid.
for companies to accrue more wealth.
Heretic, it's valid because it's reasonable.
Oh, right, I forgot. All you have to do is just say that something is reasonable, and then all criticism of it is completely invalid everywhere for all time.
Anyone who was betting against me owes me $5 now because that's the pragmatism argument.
Well, it's a very safe bet. So I'm pretty sure all of the 0 people who bet against you, I'm sorry, you didn't make any money today.
That's fine.
All right, but yeah, we're looking at
Why?
I think we're at peak thin libertarianism at this point.
But why is, say, criticizing something that exists because of state coercion meaningfully different than criticizing state coercion? That's point that's being laid out here, and it just doesn't make any fucking sense. Even within their own internal reasoning. It's kind of why I don't think that thin libertarianism is a position that they actually hold, that people actually hold. It's just something that people defend out of cognitive dissonance. As I pointed out in our stream criticizing Sarki's response to Dapperton, the deontological argument, say, for example, sort of it requires an appeal to epistemology and entailment to be coherent, but it can't really explain what those things are because by nature the deontological system, the deontological framework rejects looking at conclusions that way. It assumes that conclusions are born out of sort of putting things together like a puzzle piece. But the properties that all we're saying is that, well, in order to do that, you have to, puzzle pieces have a certain shape, and you got to know what makes that shape, what makes those shapes fit together, what entails that happening. That's the valid way to approach conclusions. Anyway, shall we continue?
Yeah, we've kind of harped on that paragraph quite a bit because
there is a lot to go over.
Yeah, tell me about it. Anyways, next one. What if the family?
I don't feel like we harked on it enough, but yeah, I think I don't really have anything else off the top of my head to say about it, so let's go on, I guess.
I'm suddenly feeling lightheaded. All right, we're good here. What if the family doctor, who funds large lobbies by paying dues to the American Medical Association, which protects its cartel status, promotes licensing regimes, etc.? What if the taxi driver, who pays his medallion fees, which allows him to operate his taxi while others who don't pay the fee cannot? Next time I'm offered a raise, should I turn it down because that will increase my tax bill, which will in turn aid the state? Should my company turn down a new customer since the resulting increase in income taxation will also help the state? How do I bear moral responsibility for any benefit a mugger might gain when I hand him my wallet at gunpoint? Should I immediately cease any state-eligible economic activity and resort to barter for all trade? Does this criticism only apply to large corporations?
Should I not drive on roads because I don't think that the state should be stealing my money to monopolize the road system? It's literally this. It's the same argument. And it's dumb for the same reasons. Well, there's an added dimension, that being agorists and left Rothbardians are again criticizing the state for creating these conditions in the first place. And if we're talking about yeah, there definitely is a difference between firms, and to act as though throughout an economy, all firms that specialize in a certain service operate around the same models of organization is fucking absurd. And I can't believe this person's even trying to defend that position. So you're saying that some local general store is in some bumfuck nowhere town is the same as Walmart. Saying that they benefit from the same type of privilege, and the state operates the same way in their local economies. I mean, the fact that there is the fact that that arrangement exists in the first place is indicative of some form of state intervention. Otherwise, people, even then, you see a lot of people in small rural towns planting gardens and farming and trading with their neighbors. So the fact that there's even a general store there is kind of indicative of the fact that that's the case, because there really isn't an incentive to have it there. Especially in the information age, where if you need something outside of the economy, you can just look around on the internet. But yeah, did you have anything to say about this?
Not really, except you kind of went over everything I was going to say. It's just the same argument that people shouldn't drive on roads. Well, yeah, you can definitely make a moral argument that people ought to participate in gray and black market activities to circumvent state intervention. And that is absolutely true, as well as take other measures to mitigate the extent to which the state can take people's assets and to fund itself, which is actually very interesting because it seems that, as I pointed out earlier, he's almost there in terms of becoming a left libertarian themselves, in terms of being able to figure out that the consequentialist understanding and the consequentialist argument is unbelievably flawed, in addition to understanding that, yeah, actually, it would be a benefit from a libertarian standpoint morally to mitigate the extent to which the state is able to make use of your own personal resources. Now, whether or not you have an ethical responsibility, no, but ethics don't prescribe behavior. Of course, they don't.
Yeah, that's an
But
interesting. That would be an interesting point if this was approaching from the consequentialist perspective, because this person has attempted to appeal to ethical principles a few times. But it would also make sense because they sort of jump back and forth between utilitarian arguments and what, to non-clowns would be an ethical argument. But yeah, if this is a consequentialist argument, sorry for presuming that you argue that the NAP is valid, whoever wrote this article, but you're also not a libertarian, because you don't have any basis for opposing political rule. You can call yourself a state skeptic, maybe. You can say that you're skeptical of the state. Libertarianism makes a specific claim about what political rule is, the nature of the state, and why it's invalid, and a specific means of demonstrating this, which is incompatible with consequentialism or just any sort of. It's making a specifically scientific claim. And consequentialism is not a scientific claim by nature; it's a type of relativism. So, but anyway, yeah, this is making the same mistake earlier of not really noting the difference. It's attempting to frame the debate as though we're arguing against the existence of doctors, because the American Medical Association has a monopoly on who can practice in the white market, or what practices can be performed, or how people can obtain their resources. in the white market. And they're trying to insinuate that we're arguing against people practicing in the white market. Well, we see it as a problem. Let's be more clear. We're arguing against that we're not arguing in a prescriptive sense that, hey, you shouldn't be doing this. We're arguing that that these institutions exist as a way of controlling people, and by getting involved in the white market, the state and at various state institutions like the American Medical Association have leverage over you and your assets, and force you to, as well as everyone else, to associate around a certain model of organization that's ultimately more beneficial for the state than it is for any party involved in that interaction. And the reason that it is more beneficial for the state is because it makes it easier for the state to track people's resources, makes it easier for the state. It makes it so the state has more leverage over everyone's assets, so that people are more likely to associate whatever the state does with their own sense of asset security. It makes it so it's more difficult to associate in the gray market because the state has more ways of fucking with you. Say, for example, if you're running a firm, the state can manipulate your credit ratings and make it so it's difficult to even do a gray market trade as a side hustle. Then there's also, getting back to what I was saying earlier, because of the framework of corporate law and intellectual property laws specifically, in many places it's not even necessary to register your firm as a corporation, or to register whatever you're selling as a type of patent. But the reason that people do this is because if you don't register your firm as a corporation, then organizations that have more political clout with the state can simply use the state to force you out of business. Can simply say, because you aren't receiving the same legal privileges as they are within the white market framework, you can, for example, throw out the trash in a certain way that local ordinance doesn't approve of, even though Walmart, for example, would be doing the exact same thing, because aspects of corporate law give them protection for liability that wouldn't be afforded to firms that haven't registered as a corporation, or state simply decides don't have that aspect of liability. Walmart by default could has a competitive advantage, and if that firm tried to compete with Walmart by operating that way, Walmart could sue them, of course. Same with intellectual property law. In many cases, even though in many cases, at least on the international market, you have to have a registered patent to trade in the international white market. In some cases, it's not legally required, even though in most markets it is, to have a product registered as a patent in the patent system. But if you don't, then a competitor can, and if you try and compete with them, they'll sue you, so they can force you out of business that way. So obviously, and of course, who decides what firm is or isn't granted a patent? Well, the state does, and the state decides this based on which firm has more political clout with them, which firm has jumped through the greatest number of political barriers to entry, licensing schemes, etc., that effectively show that they're loyal to the state. So, yeah, to treat the market as though all firms, even within the white market, or especially between the white market, the gray market, and the black market, are the same, but also to treat our criticism as though we're arguing against people as people trying to trade. We're treating, say, doctors as the aggressor and not the state and the American Medical Association, to treat our position as though that's the position we're trying to defend is at best a straw man argument, and at worst it's projection. It's project.
It's
Oh, sorry, what were you gonna say?
nothing really. I was just kind of fixating on the identification of the American Medical Association. Is that required? Are doctors required to associate with them? Like, is that a thing? I'm not entirely sure.
Well, they do need to get they do need to get licenses in order to operate as doctors, and in order to do that, they have to get a degree from some state institution, and the American Medical Association can strongly influence, at the very least, like sort of what suppliers doctors have to get their equipment from. I don't know about like deciding whether or not they can directly operate as in the medical or pharmaceutical industry, but I do know that the American Medical Association can decide what suppliers people buy from.
All right. Anyways, I'm
And,
gonna go ahead and okay,
and
we got a thing. We got a little quote here. I'll just go ahead and read the next part.
all right.
It seems that, while they harp on and on about government sanctioning of large corporations, left libertarians tend to fall silent on the same regarding smaller firms or other economic actors. As Peter Klein has said, Roderick Long and Kevin Carson do a fine job documenting a slew of government policies that favor large, complex, vertically integrated firms. Direct subsidies, of course, but also indirect benefits from intellectual property law, bootlegger and Baptist-style restrictions on market entry, transportation subsidies, various aspects of the tax code, etc. From this, they conclude that smaller, more egalitarian enterprises, such as worker-owned cooperatives, tend to flourish under a free market. The problem is that their argument cuts both ways. Certainly, large firms benefit from the state, but so do small firms. Corporations are under stricter antitrust and regulatory scrutiny, are more likely to be the victims of political rent extraction in whatever, however to pronounce that sense, and are subject to stricter disclosure requirements, SOX being the only most visible recent example, than their smaller competitors. Smaller firms benefit from state-funded incubators, SBIR awards, regional development grants, and a host of other interventions designed to foster entrepreneurship. Which set of effects outweighs the other? It is impossible to say ex ante. I don't know what that means.
Okay. So first of all, it's interesting that he cites Peter Klein, the author of this article, does, which is somebody whose view of the Austrian methodology and libertarianism is just as fucked as I would argue the author's is, as opposed to actually citing Roderick Long and Kevin Carson directly. It's interesting because if they cited Roderick Long and Kevin Carson talking about this, such as in economic calculation in the corporate commonwealth, corporations versus the market, or really any essay that they've ever written about this issue, this is not a position that they defend. First of all, this Peter Klein is making the same mistake that the author of the article is, treating our criticism of the political economy as though it's a criticism of every producer in the political economy equally, and not making note of the fact that different economic actors have different have different roles in, not just the white market, but, the gray market, the black market, the red market, and the pink markets as well. But also, and some are significantly more, more privileged than others. Some have, some create more problems than others. Some could be treated as being victims of the state as much as the people whose options are being limited by said systems, because in positions such as local firms, that's very much the case. Instead of just being able to profit around a local model, they have to be tied to the cash nexus, because in order to open their firm, they have to associate with a bank that's not even located in their town, and they have to sell, they have to sell stocks in order to, in order to even continue profiting in such a model. And because of that, certain people who they don't even know have say over the policy of their firm, not just because of what they need to do to turn a profit, but also because they legally own parts of the firm. Which, by the way, try telling me how that's an incentive that exists absent of absent barriers to entry. That's just absurd. But yeah, this also, you can also tell that this isn't a position which that this isn't actually a position which is defended by Roderick Long or Kevin Carson, because this paraphrase of what is supposedly their position includes a prescription of certain economic models that would exist in the absence of the state, when both of their points is precisely making precisely the opposite case, that economies form from the bottom up, based around the incentives of people who live in those economies. And when Kevin Carson and Roderick Long refer to egalitarianism, they're not referring to egalitarianism in a material economic sense. They're referring to the concept of equality of authority, which is something that exists in an ethical framework strictly. And equality of authority is to note that is the position that in the absence of institutional monopolies and people who firms which operate around institutional coercion that attempts to claim everyone's assets or attempts to force people to associate with them, that everyone has an equal say, not just over their assets, but equal leverage in terms of how they associate with those assets in order to further their own interests. And therefore an ethical society, could be characterized more as just people not being able to have authority over others. That's a negation of the concept of prescriptive ethical principles, or attempting to inform your ethical principles with a prescriptive framework. So, yeah, do you have anything to add, or?
I mean, I'm trying to think of what examples of the so-called state-funded incubators and awards for entrepreneurship that he could be referring to. And most of those aren't actually for small businesses, like, at all. Yeah, there are some government programs that subsidize small businesses. This is absolutely true. However, it goes without saying that they distort incentives as well and are worthy of criticism. Yeah. But that said, the main beneficiaries of these so-called small business loans are almost universally large businesses. I mean, didn't the overwhelming majority of the payment protection program loans all go to, like, large corporations?
It did, and that's just what I was going to add to that is yeah, subsidies are there mainly to externalize maintenance costs for firms that have more political protection from the state. And that tends to be firms like Walmart, just as the recurring example, or Citigroup, or any of these other major financial institutions. Um, Used specifically to make it so these for these people who are unfortunate enough to register an LLC in, say, a local economy are essentially a permanent serf class to these corporations. They're these corporations in the state.
Mm-hmm. And anyway, should we continue?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, and just a quick question. What does Fred McChesney mean? Like in terms of political rent extraction in the Fred McChesney sense.
Yeah, I gotta be perfectly honest. I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I've probably heard the case before, but there are a lot of things that I forget because they reference the name of the person who is involved. But I'm more than familiar with specifically what's being referenced. I just don't remember the person's name. Like last night, for instance, I was having a conversation with the people here. About Jeff Winehouse, and I was more than familiar with. For those who don't know, Jeff Winehouse was he was Cop Block before Cop Block existed, and he was he was exposing a lot of the evil things that local police were doing. And you can find this video on the internet. The police got they got a warrant to seize his computer and all of his hard drives because he was apparently going to expose something big. Then about 2 or 3 weeks later, they they messaged him. Some members of the police department messaged him, told him, "Hey, come meet us in the middle of nowhere, and we'll give you your setup back." And when he wasn't an idiot, so he showed up with a spy watch, and yeah, what he recorded the whole thing. When he showed up, he was surrounded by black sedans, and they just shot him at point blank range like 8 times. I was familiar with that, but I didn't, when it was brought up to me in conversation, it was just referenced as the Jeff Winehouse incident, and I didn't recognize it. My point is that I may very well be familiar with the Fred McChesney incident, but I don't know. I don't know it just being referenced as the Fred McChesney incident.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I don't know anything about that either, and I haven't heard that story either. But I mean, that's not terribly surprising. That would be something that an armed, violent gang would do to someone who is going to expose them. I mean, at some level, I think he had to have been aware that that was going to happen, right? That he would just been
Yeah,
straight
he
up
told
murdered.
his. That's why he brought his spy watch. It's a watch that has a camera in it, and apparently he told a bunch of people he was trying to get somebody to come with him because he was pretty sure that that was going to happen. Hey, cops messaging you saying, "Hey, come meet us in the middle of nowhere." It's not an invitation to anything good happening. So
Mm-hmm.
only a really naive boomer would ever hear that and say, "Oh, I'm probably not going to get shot in the head."
Yeah, that's that glowed, and I think it just showcases exactly what we've been talking about for a while now. where if you're going to be doing something big and it's going to be controversial, you usually want to keep a lid on it until it's already done.
Yeah.
So
All right, let's
anyways,
continue.
every firm, indeed every individual, benefits in some ways from the state while being victimized in others. In most cases, it is extremely difficult to determine whether a particular firm is, on net, a beneficiary or a victim of the state. Many on the libertarian
No, it's
left,
not. No, it's not.
it's
And
really not.
that's literally. Do I even really need to point out the fact that the case is being made here? We need the state in order to associate in a state with each other in a state society. Oh God, I guess all these gray and black markets that the state diverts an insane amount of resources to trying to put a lid on don't exist. The fact that the government needs to use violence in the first place, needs to threaten people in the first place in order to not associate in those economies. I guess that's. I know the government's not particularly not particularly savvy with how they divert their resources, but damn.
Yeah, I mean, like, where do you even begin trying to explain the fallacy of trying to examine state victimization from a sliding scale of being a beneficiary or a victim? I
Entire
mean,
fucking isn't the entire fucking reason that cops have to be as stretched out by the state as they are, mainly to try to enforce those legislative decrees. And since those legislative decrees are directed specifically at how people trade and how they use their resources, wouldn't it be reasonable to argue that cops and prisons specifically exist to try to stop people from doing that? Try and create that risk factor.
hmm I'm sorry, I'm just fixated on that because I'm just trying to understand, like, how it is that you could even try to dichotomize that. That, like, just think about it like this. Suppose you get mugged at gunpoint, and then the guy gives you a sandwich and walks away. Are you a beneficiary or are you a victim?
But yeah, any on the libertarian left will answer, "Oh, I'm sure this is definitely going to follow with something that we actually argue." And
Mhm.
everything else in this essay so far, if you want to call it that, has been perfectly 100% accurately representing the position he's trying to argue against. Anyway, many on the libertarian left will answer that objection by querying their own ideology, asking, "Is this company offensive to my sensibilities?" Oh God! If
I
so,
mean, I can just tell you how many times I've looked at firms in the white market, and before I even consider shopping there, I asked, "Is this company offensive to my sensibilities?"
yeah, are there enough? Has this store modeled enough trans models to showcase what clothes they have in the store? That's definitely the first question that I ask. That's also how I see my economic actions. I definitely decide every little thing that I do based on based on how much revenue the state makes, as opposed to diverting my assets to trying to in a way that attempts to subvert the institutions which make it more difficult to counter economically associate so that everybody can counter economically associate. Ergo, what agorism actually is, and not the retarded straw man that people who have only read Rothbard's essay attempting to respond to the new Libertarian Manifesto and don't know anything else about it would argue.
Anyways, I'm just going to continue this paragraph. If so, the left libertarian will notice how a firm benefits from the state and ignore how the state is at the same time a monkey on its back, conclude it's a net beneficiary, and also forget to blame the state for creating the situation in the first place. Many left libertarians... What?
Yeah, that's that's literally our position. State created these situations. They're both coercive, and in being coercive, they need to limit. They need to necessarily limit how we can use resources and the ways in what resources we can use. In order for it to be coercive, that's a necessary entailment. So, what the fuck is this person talking about? They clearly haven't read anything by any of the people they're trying to argue against.
Which is actually
they don't even know what position. They don't even know the position they're arguing against. In fact, they seem to be trying to conflate. Left Rothbardian argument or the agorist argument with that of the neo-Marxist reinterpretation of anarchism here, because they at most they're trying to argue that we're taking libertarianism and like adding on to libertarianism, as opposed to trying to ask what entails libertarian principles. And this is suggested by the phrase their own ideology, as if to sort of separate us from the actual libertarians.
I mean, he pointed out earlier, or he tried to criticize how left libertarians observe that the state creates, or the state alters the incentives in a marketplace through its various interventions. And yet at the same time, he claims to say that left libertarians don't acknowledge that the state creates the situation in the first place.
Yeah, I don't know how he can rationalize that.
I'm kind of curious how he's managed to square that parallelogram. But that's a little bit of doublethink going on there. I'm just saying. Now, anyways,
Yes,
many
left libertarian. Oh, okay. I was gonna read, but do you want to?
You go ahead.
Many left libertarians simply want to find some way to arrive at the conclusion that big business X is a net beneficiary of the state, so it doesn't matter how far backward they have to bend to do it. Except, again, that's not the position we're arguing. We're arguing that, as noted earlier, that white market and the model that white market firms operate around is defended by the state, and therefore libertarians don't have any, not only don't have any reason to be characterizing that as a product of free association, but it's actually at best inaccurate, and at worst misleading, depending on your intentions to argue that position. And also, as pointed out in my last interjection, this is again just presupposing, like, really this person's arguments would not work outside of a prescriptive framework, and they're not even touching that core disagreement. I'm coming to the realization, or at least I've come to realize, this person's probably a consequentialist, i.e. a fake libertarian. But yeah, they're looking at this the wrong way. in order for a coercive institution to exist, it needs to operate around certain models to reinforce its interests, and it needs to promote certain models to have those organizational incentives met. And doing so necessarily requires coercion. So they're looking at this the wrong way. It's not like it's artificial scarcity is a product of coercion. It entails coercive means. So that's the reason why we're skeptical of things like the wage system, where these firms are benefiting from a or the monopoly on security, the monopoly on land, which gives certain actors a tremendous amount of leverage over other actors in society, because that's a condition that exists specifically because of institutional coercion, and that exists specifically to perpetuate the state. And as a result, to argue that these firms could exist or that the wage system could exist, it's effectively to argue that these sorts of inequalities of authority exist without systemic coercion, and that is not coherent for the reasons that I've just elaborated on.
Mm-hmm. I'm just trying to figure out what's so important about trying to identify big business as a beneficiary of the state. You can certainly argue that them making use of and even calling for, through lobbying and various donations to government officials and state agents, that they are very much calling for continued intervention and continued victimization of people's rights, and thus making them subject to certain forfeitures in regards to whether or not you can aggress against them, which is a conversation for another time. However, simply identifying them as a net beneficiary doesn't really tell us anything. The question about whether or not
what even is a net beneficiary? What are we? That's a Hoppian concept. What are we talking about? Like, according to whose utility? I thought utility was subjective. Why are we talking about that in a prescriptive sense? And why are we not making the distinction between economic and ethical principles? Or at least, why are we not specifying which one we're talking about?
I don't think that they possibly can, probably because their understanding of Austrianism and just subjective theory of value is just so lacking that probably this idea has never even occurred to them. Maybe it's not their fault. Maybe they haven't really looked into economics all that much, and so they probably think net beneficiary from a purely monetary standpoint. That big business receives more. That big business receives more from the government than they pay either in taxes or lobbying, which statistically speaking, in pure dollar amounts, is completely true. However, whether or not that makes them a net beneficiary is ultimately a question of subjective opinion. It's reasonable to assume. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to add, I started talking before I realized you were done, so I apologize. But I guess since I'm speaking, I just will add this very quickly. Another issue here is that this also assumes that we're again talking about ethics that we're talking about ethics in a sort of political sense. Like you can have a tax rate that's more or less ethical, because that's a problem that the prescriptive ethical view creates, as opposed to looking at the state as a sort of oppressive system of institutions that makes it so certain actors are systematically disadvantaged and others are, others, if they gain clout with the state, can benefit at their expense.
Well, you see, Esso, if I punch you in the face and then give you $100 bill, that makes me punching you in the face okay. That's how that works.
If this politician promises to tax at 5%, then that's better than that's more ethical than a politician who promises to tax at 10%.
Well, you see, I know a politician who's promising to tax at 1% and also promising to bomb all the brown people.
Problem is not that there's an organization which could, by whatever they decree, steal any of your assets at any time without having to give a justification, or because they have that kind of leverage over you. No, the only issue is just that some are taking more than others. God damn, I can't believe that I ever used to argue libertarianism like this. I can't believe that there are people who consider themselves libertarians and then argue that position.
Well, I mean, I have the opposite approach. I see it as like, look how far we've come. Look how greatly our understanding of libertarianism, libertarian principles, and economics has expanded. That we can now look back on that with maybe not nostalgia, but at least some satisfaction.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I don't disagree. It's just trying to get in that headspace without citing cognitive dissonance or just a lack of understanding. I can't ever really. That's just the way that people come to hold this position. I just can't. It's not really possible to rationalize it any other way. As soon as you start looking into competing approaches to understanding logic, just hands down, the Aristotelian position just fucking destroys all the others.
It's great. Anyways, should we continue?
Yeah, sure.
If we were to take the vulgar libertarian argument to its logical conclusion, we would have to condemn all current market activity, all the way from an old grandma paying for groceries with her social security check to a young kid buying his first iPad with fiat currency. We don't have a truly free market in anything anywhere. If anything, this left libertarian criticism is a no true Scotsman fallacy. If it benefits by the state in some way, that it can't be an entity that can survive on true free market principles, but it also misses the overall point. Yes, many libertarians, especially anarcho-capitalists, want the state out of everything, and defenses. I did that on purpose, by the way. I remember listening to Democracy, the God That Failed, like years ago when I first read it through a audiobook, and I swear that's how they pronounced it. Anarcho-capitalist. I am not joking. I am also reasonably sure that was a text-to-speech reading, but I'm not sure, since it sounded reasonable. It sounded human enough, but yeah, that's what happened. Anyways, and defenses of this position often boil down to the fact that we know that the market, absent the state, would provide much more of these great innovations. Throwing out every action a group takes because it does something bad elsewhere is silly. See black and white fallacy. The argument is even more fallacious when a firm is actually doing a good thing instead of the perfect thing, because the latter is illegal.
I don't think we really need to address any of that, because the two main problems with that section we've already addressed. No, we are not directly saying that people who are running white market firms are coercing people who are spending, their money to obtain things from them. And we are arguing that we're arguing that, depending on where they stand as producers in the white market, they're also being coerced. But if they are part of that privileged class of firms, then the institution that allows them to exist is coercing everyone else. That's what we're saying specifically. And we're saying that the reason that there is such a that they have the things that allow them to do that is because of state coercion, is because of this sort of institutional influence created by the state. And in the latter sense, again, the reason that we highlight, if at all, the sort of information problems that are created by these privileged firms and the lack of access to resources is because that is something that entails coercive actions. So we highlight this as a way of identifying what a coercive action is, specifically what a coercive action taken by the state is, or just, you could say a coercive action in general, but since we're talking about institutions, we have to specify the sort of incentives of those institutions, as opposed to just as opposed to just a mugger stealing from somebody. Yeah, that deprives people of resources, but it's a single event as opposed to an overarching system that tries to influence how everyone behaves around its interests by threatening them with violence as a way to reinforce its ability to do so.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm still trying to parse my way through this thing. I don't see why you would I don't see why I don't see why you would bring up the point of grandma paying with Social Security or kid paying with fiat currency unless you intend to defend that.
Yeah, fair enough. Is he going to defend the Social Security system or the fiat proprietary financial system?
Well, you see, there are net benefits to Social Security and fiat currency, so therefore you can't throw that out. You can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So it's not a perfect solution, but it
benefits like it allows a political class to exist at the expense of everyone else.
Yes, that is definitely a net benefit, because without the Social Security check, grandma would starve to death. She would never be able to pay for groceries.
Because, I mean, to the political class, that's a benefit to them.
Well, yeah, and grandma's a member of the political class, so therefore it benefits her too. See, it's a net benefit. You don't expect everything to be perfect. That's just if you think everything should be perfect, that's just black and white thinking. And black and white thinking is bad.
No, that's having a coherent understanding of entailment. Actually having an informed idea of what your principles are, and making a claim of truth about reality, like what you're supposed to be doing as a libertarian. You're not just saying, well, no, I prefer to not have a state, or I prefer to not have political rule. No, you're trying to explain why those things are necessarily evil and what allows them to exist. What problems they create in terms of their ability to justify themselves. But yeah, I've noticed at several points in this article that when we're talking about net benefits, we're referring to good things in terms of the specific act that's being employed. Now, I know that's mostly because this person is trying to be weaselly and disingenuous and avoid having to specify specifically, pardon the redundancy, but specifically, what organizational models or what policies that firms operate around. Because if he pointed to specific examples, we could actually argue whether or not they're defended by the financial system, or the financial system, for instance, the political financial system allows them to exist. I know for the most part, that's the reason the author's probably doing this. But if we were to look at their methodology, they genuinely would not be able to specify what those things are if they were to try. And that's, first of all, that's going to be a big problem if you're trying to have a debate with people who are attempting to argue a fundamentally different epistemology, a fundamentally different idea of what entailments are to principle. But it creates some issues trying to justify libertarianism. What counts as a good thing or a bad thing? In fact, this entire article, more than anything, has just been problems that either consequentialists or thin libertarians have with trying to argue against the state. If they don't have an idea of what the state as an institution is, or they don't have any anything to point to, anything tangible informing their claims against the state, what counts as a good thing or a bad thing? And why would you say definitively that it is? What is the nature of good or bad? What's the boundary around those things? Like what framework are you making that claim from within? Are we talking about ethics? If so, why and how? How do you argue that ethics should be seen?
Well, I can guarantee you this is someone who does not argue that ethics are something that libertarians should even consider, at least insofar as ethics and morality are identical. And this is someone who almost certainly does believe that, sees no differentiation between them whatsoever.
Hoppians are also a lot like that, or Hoppians also defend positions that, at least superficially sound that way. So this person could be a Hoppian.
I wouldn't rule it out. So anyways.
But, we have one last paragraph, and we've been going on for 2.5 hours, so...
Yeah, we should go ahead. We should probably wrap this up afterwards.
Yeah, sure. But I'll ask the chat, and we'll read the chat after we're done responding to this paragraph, whether or not we should either continue responding to these, this series of articles in a future stream, the midweek stream next week, or whether or not we should potentially just make a video responding to the rest. Anyway, let's read the last paragraph here.
Mm-hmm. Exchange still can be mutually beneficial, even when the starting point is heavily state involved. We can praise the benefits of market exchange that exists today, even when it's hampered in various ways by the state. We must recognize all the ways in which the state distorts our society and economy, but at the same time discern between state-hampered business practices and outright rent-seeking and state privilege, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Frickin' hell, I used that term in the last paragraph.
Yeah,
I knew he would do
that
this.
Seems to, there's nothing new in that last paragraph. It seems to be that this author can't look at any actors in industry as anything other than being in a position of being in a position of disadvantage created by the state. And while strictly speaking, that's true, even organizations like Walmart, the state obviously has leverage over them. The state, for example, could simply just either imprison or kill anyone that operates their management, and there'd be nothing any of them could do about it because the state has the monopoly on security and arbitration. But they operate, the firms sort of at the top of the political economic privilege we were talking about earlier, exist in a codependent relationship with the government. So the government very much needs these firms to exist because those firms are the means through which the state gains control over our assets, locks us into having to associate with financial institutions in order to hold down a job without being harassed in most cases. And in doing that, requiring us to use their fiat currency so that they can control our savings and have another level of leverage over us through the financial institution. Through the financial institutions, and also monopolize supply chains, both so that they can control, or cartelize supply chains, both so that they can control our incentives by controlling our access to resources and who we can get our resources from. And also linking us into the cash nexus in another sense by requiring us to use fiat in order to obtain most goods.
Mm-hmm.
Making it impossible making it not impossible, but exceptionally difficult to associate in local economies, even though some people are still able to do this. Ultimately, though, it's a problem with the fact these institutions exist, and as long as the infrastructure that they've created continues to exist, these problems will continue to exist, which is why libertarian means are specifically engaging in productive human action designed specifically to subvert that infrastructure, to identify what's upholding that infrastructure and to subvert it.
Left libertarianism has an understanding of the ways in which the state distorts our society and economy and culture and everything else down to a freaking science. So this guy clearly has. I mean, we've seen this in others of his articles that we've done glances over previously, but this guy clearly has no understanding of and has done no research into left libertarianism other than incredibly superficial manners. It seems like his understanding is largely limited to criticism from the thin libertarian position of left libertarianism, rather than actually understanding philosophy itself. Because I don't think there are any left libertarians, so called, that would ever be critical of the idea of market exchange or skeptical of the benefits of market exchange. So that whole point about we can praise the benefits of market exchange as it exists today is an absolute canard and a straw man.
Yeah, we have a different idea of, or we have a different notion of sort of what entails these things, specifically the idea that in order to have a coherent, clear understanding of libertarian principles that entail the positions are required to even make those claims in the first place. But yeah, that's the only difference fundamentally between left Rothbardians and your sort of classic Rothbardians, is just where as opposed to classic Rothbardians who are agnostic on questions outside of libertarian principles, we stop and ask, well, no, specifically what the interests of the state are, how the state came into being, what political institutions are, how they work, the sort of effects that they have on society. Those are all very important questions, and a lot of them, if not all of them, are important because they're required in order for us to understand what opposition to that means. So I am, now there's more to this series that, by the way, what did the chat say about
Yeah, let me
whether or
check.
not we should respond in the form of an essay or more streams?
Nothing. They haven't remarked on it at all.
Oof.
Yeah.
But I don't know. We may or may not respond to more of these articles. We probably will just write an essay, but if we do get around to it. But the one thing that what I'll add is that's essentially the extent to what left Rothbardians are arguing is, well, you need to know what those things are in order to argue against them. And I am convinced that it is not possible to argue against that position arguing in good faith. I haven't seen it yet. And in fact, most of the attempted rebuttals I've seen don't even actually understand what our position is. Most of them attempt to paint us as like neo-Marxists or something along those lines, or they confuse in what sense we're expressing skepticism to the wage system. But no, we're arguing the same thing as any other Rothbardian. But my point that I'll get back to is just I don't see any way that you could argue against our epistemology, our sort of approach to understanding these principles. And I haven't seen anyone try, so I'm convinced that 99% of most of the people who even address our arguments or have straw mans that are closer to what we actually do argue, I'm convinced that most of them just don't actually understand the root of the disagreement. Either that or they're being actively disingenuous because I've noticed that all of them, the first thing that they try to do is establish fundamentally we're talking about prescriptive ethics, or coercive means don't necessarily entail any sort of economic or social implications. So those are two separate things. That's the first thing in the premise of attempted rebuttals to left Rothbardianism that they try to establish, and they establish them as presuppositions. They don't try to ever rationalize those arguments. So I'm convinced that most of the arguments are made in bad faith. I'll be delighted to see an attempt to respond to our actual position. I've been trying to get that out of Hoppians and thin libertarians over the last year. I'd love to be mistaken, because honestly, being a radical within a radical movement is not that fun. But it's necessary, but it's not fun. I mean, I'd love to be wrong, but I can't know if I am if you're not even going to attempt to engage what I actually argue.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. This guy, it sounds like at multiple points he comes like this close to understanding and this close to arriving at our conclusions as well. He's just, I don't know what it is. He just has some kind of cognitive dissonance in regards to, I don't know if he's hung up on the label of left and still believes in the left versus right dichotomy, and therefore like he hears the term like left libertarian or alliance for libertarian left, and just thinks like, ooh, leftist bad, leftists are SJWs, leftists need to get wrecked on YouTube compilations.
Seems to be what he's thinking because of that paragraph where he attempts to portray our skepticism towards the white market as moral fagging over certain policies that are not even policies, but like whether or not a company chooses to virtue signal to these sort of intersectional, cringy, woke positions.
Mm-hmm. Now, yeah, I don't really have much more to add to that. We were planning on actually going over other articles, but this went a lot longer than I think SORI anticipated.
Yeah, if every article is going to require a 2.5 hour response, I may just like write a response, even though I fucking really it may take a few months because after this video I'm working on is done, I am mostly going to put out either bad take shorts videos or essays because I fucking do not want to. I don't like the response format at all.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, as I mentioned at the beginning of the stream, it forces me to comment more times than not about subjects which intersect with mainstream politics. But also it comes off as low hanging fruit, and doesn't really give me a whole lot of direction that I could go with a potential response that it gives me nothing that I haven't argued before. And while a lot of people are comfortable with making the same arguments over and over again, video after video, I try not to do that, even though, in responding to articles like this, or like you'll see that in our stream format that I end up having to repeat a lot of the same argument stream after stream. That's fine for streams because the point of the stream is to try to interact with you guys in the audience, and also to comment on things we wouldn't otherwise on the main channel. But just as far as essays go, I could not be fucking bothered any. I just do not want to fucking respond to content. It's fucking. It's fucking. I said low hanging fruit before. I don't want to say that again. It's low brow, and I would much rather write essays about like philosophical nuances that people in the libertarian movement aren't that familiar with. So I could, actually be putting out accessible material on the subject so that fucking Tom Woods or these other paleo vulgar types aren't monopolizing the airspace. Well, not monopolizing, but you know what I mean. Those aren't going to be the first people that people who are interested in libertarianism come across.
Yeah, hopefully not. Kojal Ted asks, weren't you going to debate Shane Killian?
I still do intend on debating Shane Killian, and I've been trying to organize that for over a year, but every time I message him about it, he's either busy or doesn't respond, and I don't want to assume bad faith on his part, but yeah, the thing which caused me to want to debate him was an exchange that we had about thick libertarianism, and he was arguing in a very disingenuous way. So he's a busy guy, so I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. What does he have? Like 2 or 3 daughters?
I don't know.
Has at least a justification for being too busy to debate, but I mean he streams every week, so again, I don't want to assume bad faith on his part, but it's starting to come off to me like it's sort of bad faith, like he's avoiding me.
In the meantime, I think we
That's
can. Should we talk about the Hoppian debate?
Oh yeah, sure. Something that we have been hyping up. I think since the end of the summer, because we finished up our essay series in August, and some editors from the website Hoppian.org, which is a website that publishes articles by various Hoppians. They attempted to respond to our essays on a series of streams, our essay, or parts of our essay, and long story short, it's hot garbage, and we wanted to, debate them on stream. They said when we asked them about that they were busy throughout the fall, they'd be busy throughout the holidays, and now it's, as I understand it, both End Democracy and Colton Maxwell Anderson, who are the people we were trying to debate, as I understand it, both of them are in college, so I could understand why they'd be busy, especially during the holidays. But I asked them again a month after the holidays would have ended about a week ago. Hey, what about that debate? I haven't heard any response since. So I don't want to assume bad faith on their part, but considering how they responded to our stream, it's a bit less of a stretch than assuming bad faith on on Shane Killian. But yeah, it's starting to look that way with with them too. And I don't know, Heretic, why are all these people scared to come on and debate our ideas with us?
Well, I don't want to assume bad faith on their part. It definitely sounded like the Hoppians did want to debate us. However, it's been a while now. Like if they're watching, which is honestly kind of unlikely, we're still open. You have our Discord usernames, so you can ping us at any time. We're open to scheduling, and our schedules are a lot more open than yours are, it seems. So yeah, we have quite a bit of scheduling flexibility. So just go ahead and give us a ping whenever you're ready to, talk about how it is that Hop is a saboteur of libertarianism and arguably one of the worst philosophers in that was ever identified as being part of our movement.
I guess I'll just give you some advice, because you made this mistake in the stream response to our essay, even though we specifically explained multiple times in our essay why you can't dismiss our arguments this way. To say, for example, speciality is like hierarchy, therefore that's an example of natural aristocracy. Or CCs are voluntary because they have contracts, and contracts are part of property theory, therefore you agree with CCs. This is a logical fallacy known as equivocation, because you're referencing a subject in an ambiguous way in order to draw logical connections that are not justified by either your or my internal reason, by our reasoning. If you're going to approach debating us essentially the same way that you approached responding to our essay, I could understand why you would be trying to avoid it. But yeah, don't try that. It's not going to work.
Mhm.
And if that's what, and I say this not as some sort of like humble brag or as a way to put them down. It's just I really fucking don't want that kind of debate to happen, because I find type of that type of argument to be very fucking annoying, and it doesn't produce any sort of productive, fruitful conversation. And what I'm looking for is an attempt to explore like your justification for your, as in the Hoppian justification for arguing for libertarianism in the sense that they do. Anyway, should we end the stream here?
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain argument I want to bring up with the Hoppians as well, but I'm gonna save it for when there is a Hoppian that is willing to debate us on stream. So, anyways, yeah, let's go ahead and wrap this up here. Everyone, we'll have another stream on Friday. Thank you for stopping by, and we'll see you next time. Bye.